And thank you all so much for making time to come over today for this presentation. Today's presentation is Vietnam, America's Most Controversial War. This is part of our Kentucky Read series of presentations through a collaboration with the Learning Commons and the Division of Arts and Humanities. And over the next couple of weeks, we are excited to sponsor a series of presentations on topics that relate to the novel for Kentucky Reads, which is Bobby Ann Mason's Dear Anne. Our presenter today is Professor Barry Kennedy. He started working for SKYCTC in 2003 and is a professor of history. He is teaching multiple different content areas within the subject, and his favorite part of teaching is challenging his students to think and creating lifelong relationships. In today's session, Kennedy will be providing an overview of the war on Vietnam with some information about the controversies related to the war. The goal of today's session is that you become aware of this trying time in American history, as well as the power and political might of the media. As you read Dear Anne, pay special attention to the turmoil of the nation during the Vietnam era, as well as the decisions forced upon the young people in the book, many of whom were not even old enough to vote because the voting age was 21 at the time. The Division of Arts and Humanities and the Learning Commons would like to thank Service One Credit Union for the generous donation to our foundation that allowed us to provide books for students through our collaboration. Thank you, Professor Kennedy, for your presentation today. If you have any questions, we'll take those at the end of the session in the Teams chat or from our live audience.
All right, good afternoon. We will get started because I have a tendency to get bogged down. That sometimes is bad, sometimes good, sometimes it's bad. The war in Vietnam lasted approximately from September of 1950 until March of 1973, which makes it a 23-year war almost. And that, just to kind of put in perspective, you know, the Civil War is 5 years, World War II is 4 years, we're in World War I for a year, we're in Korea for 3, the War on Terror was something like 19. So this is still technically the longest war we've ever been in. And the focus today is on what makes Vietnam, what makes this specific war so controversial, and why does it have such a legacy in the minds of the people? Well, the first thing is we have to understand the stage that we're in. We are in the middle of the Cold War, and there's great fear of communism. This fear of communism goes back to the 1920s with the creation of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And then, of course, you fast forward after World War II, the Cold War explodes in terms of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And you get more House Un-American Activities Committees. You also get Joseph McCarthy, who really kind of set the stage for a lot of panic, a lot of fear in the nation at that point in time. So there's a lot of people afraid of communism. There's a lot of people afraid of the spread of communism. And then we get the space race. In October of 1957, when Sputnik went up in the air, people went crazy. There's this major fear that the Soviets are going to put nuclear warheads on the moon. And if you don't know, NASA, while it was created to quote unquote get us into space, in reality, the purpose was to get us to the moon, to get to the moon first. If you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, there is a quote in there that is a very accurate quote that was based on a quote of the time. Whoever conquers space first, and they were primarily talking about the moon, makes the rules. And we wanted it to be us and not the communists. So you see that there's this fear, there's this heightened sense, even before the war really takes off. And as I said just a minute ago, the first quote-unquote military advisors get to Vietnam in September of 1950. Well, the thing about this is, we're just getting started in the Korean War. In the middle of June the 25th, 19 we're already concerned about Vietnam. And it's a place at this point in time, it really wasn't referred to as Vietnam, it was referred to French Indochina. But in 1950, we have roughly 150 advisors. At the end of 1960, it's 900. At the end of 1961, it's 3,200. 62, 9,000. 63, almost 17,000. And it will jump up to in 1969 at an all-time high of 543,000 troops that are going to go and be involved in the war in Vietnam. So you have this massive expansion, this utter massive expansion of war that really, it's slow to start and then it explodes almost out of nowhere. And as you're going to see in just a minute, some of the big controversies are, well, why in the world are we there? Why in the world are we concerned about this little bitty place that most people couldn't locate it on a map if you gave them 2 or 3 choices of one of these is Vietnam? And the answer is a complicated one. One, we're afraid of the spread of communism. 2, we believe in what's known as the domino theory. If one communist nation falls, if one nation falls to communism, all the rest will fall. And then there's the Truman Doctrine, which is the policy of containment. We can't allow any other nations to go communist. And then we've got a very unique relationship with France. See, before World War II, French Indochina, which included parts of modern-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, was owned by France. And after World War II was over, it was our stance that the French should get that territory back. Well, the problem is, they didn't want to be under French control. The French built a fort called Dien Bien Phu, which, by the way, was built in a valley surrounded by hills. Not really smart. And in 1954, this fort fell, and France had to surrender 12,000 men. It's at this point in time where we start to really escalate. There's this idea within the American government, especially within the State Department, that we have to save France. We have to save face for France. And the Pentagon believed that we needed France to be strong and powerful in case the Soviets invaded Europe. By the way, 1 year after Dien Bien Phu, we rearmed West Germany, which is something we said we were not going to do. Why? Because of the absolute mess that France left in Vietnam. But this is why we get involved. We have to save France's face. It's a really, from a hindsight point of view, it's really, really silly. But at that point in time, the fear of communism, the fear from the space, as the space race is getting kicked off and everything is just adding together. More controversy in terms of the wars. This is going to be the first TV war, the first televised war. People are going to see stuff on TV for the first time ever. And whenever I'm talking to students about this subject, I always say, anytime something happens to you for the first time, you never, ever, ever forget it. And I commonly use the example of a first love. You never forget that first love. You may stay with that first love. You may come to appreciate that person later in life as you go your separate ways, or you may just absolutely come to hate them. I don't know which one it is, but the point is that first leaves a mark on you. So all of a sudden, for the first time, people are turning on the evening news and they're listening to Walter Cronkite, who was the voice of reason. And he's telling them about death in Vietnam. He's telling them about the destruction in Vietnam. They're watching on TV machine guns, and they're hearing the machine gun fire in the middle of the jungle. And this is something that American society had never experienced before. You know, today we turn on the news and we see violence everywhere. You know, how many times do you turn on the news and you hear about murder or other violent crimes? In a lot of ways, we become desensitized. But these people were not desensitized. And it left a mark. And in a lot of ways, it's going to lead to what we'll talk about eventually, a challenge to the establishment, where the people are going to go from believing the government for the most part to now the idea that you should never trust the government. Cronkite and others are going to report on daily stats that are given from the Pentagon. And one of my former professors, Dr. Francis Thompson, used to say, there's no basis for these numbers. The media wanted numbers, so the military gave them to them. You know, today we killed so many Viet Cong. We had so many soldiers wounded. This many soldiers died. And the thing about it is if you think about it, it keeps death in the forefront of everybody's mind. And again, we're talking about a generation that has never experienced this before. You know, World War II was much bigger. It was much worse. But people didn't own TVs. They would go to the movie theater and they would see a 3 or 4 minute reel of quote unquote government propaganda showing them what the government wanted to show about the war. Namely, focusing on the positives and how people could serve. Well, this is different in this time period. The focus is on death. The focus is on destruction. And it's going to lead to protests. It's going to lead to a lot of protests, not just on college campuses. You know, we typically think of Kent State, which was a horrific event, but it's going to lead to young men who are 18 years old who don't have the right to vote saying, I'm not going to war. They'll burn draft cards. Women burn their bras. It's a symbol of defiance. In a lot of ways, this gives birth to what we may sometimes refer to as the hippie movement, which is really more about peace, the rejection of American norms such as marriage, and the idea of free love and things of that nature. But it's much more about getting away from what they believe to be a corrupt government, sending young people that didn't have a voice to an early grave. We also have incidents, some of which are staged. Perhaps the most famous is Quang Duc. Quang Duc was a Buddhist. By the way, the majority of people in Vietnam in the 1970s were Buddhists. The French, of course, had a Catholic regime that was led by a man by the name of Diem. And we sponsored Diem's leadership. Quang Duc, to protest this Catholic monk being in charge of his country, sat down in the middle of the street. He knew there were reporters around him. He saw the cameras. Poured gasoline on his head and set himself on fire. Now, we've seen all kinds of movies. Just think for a second. Go back to the 1930s, when you have the very first cuss word in cinema. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. People were in an uproar. He cussed in the movies. And now, But all they see is violence, they see destruction, and they see this man literally sit in the middle of the street and burn himself up. You talk about leaving a mark on people who saw it, leaving a scar. All of these things contribute to the war coverage. You know, how the war was covered. And I need to make sure that we distinguish, you know, from the idea today of fake news compared to the idea back then of the war just being covered. Of course, war is not a very popular subject. However, war does equal ratings. And people rely on individuals like Cronkite and others for all of their information. There's no 24-hour news networks. So a lot of times the reporting that comes in, it comes in from a very small area. And a really good example of this is what happens during the Tet Offensive. During the Tet Offensive of 1968, the United States got caught militarily not paying attention to the intelligence, and the communists attacked. Were kicked out of virtually every city in South Vietnam. But within 72 hours, those cities have been taken back. But what's the focus? We were kicked out of the cities. Why was that the focus? Because we were told, the people were told every day on TV, we're winning, they're on their last legs, they're on their last breath. Stay with us, the war will be over soon. And now all of a sudden you have this event, and it appears that the contrary is true. By the way, we know that this is a last-ditch effort because we know that they were arming 10-year-olds and teaching them how to fire AK-47s in 1968 in Vietnam. But in terms of coverage overall, this is a new experience for the American public. And it is going to be through this new experience, through this media coverage, that most of the controversy comes about from the war. Because what the government says, which was held so true under FDR during World War II, now all of a sudden it appears we can't trust these people. And that adds to the political controversies of the war. The thing that led to the biggest expansion of the conflict was the Gulf of Tonkin. We know that on one occasion, someone fired upon U.S. Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. The other incident that supposedly happened took place during an electrical storm. And according to Dr. Thompson, who I've referred to already, he said it's a good possibility we might have been a shooting at whales. We don't know. But needless to say, President Lyndon Johnson goes to Congress and says, we're under attack. I need the authority to fight this war. Only Congress can declare war. But what happens is Congress passes on their responsibility and gives the authority to the president. This happened with the war on terror as well. Why is this important? Well, if the war goes well, Congress can say, look what we did, we're heroes. But if the war goes poorly, it's his fault. We're taking power back. Guess what's going to happen in 1968 and 69 and 70 and 71 and 72? That's exactly what happens because the war goes so poorly. And needless to say, the Democratic Party was in power, and the party splits. And thus, you have the doves that want to end the war right now, and then you have what we may call the war hawks who want to continue the war. In fact, they want to expand the war. Going right along with this was one of the biggest, not smart, I'll say it that way, decisions that the government made. We're not going to use the reserves. We're going to fund this war through the draft. And we're going to draft 18-year-olds. Thus, the protests. We don't send over reserves. We don't send over those who willfully join the military. We're sending those who don't want to fight. Now, in World War II, we drafted a lot of people who didn't want to fight, but there was a difference. That difference was Japan attacked the United States first. Now we're sending young men to a place that they don't know where it is, and they don't know how we're going. And not only that, but most terms were roughly 2 years, and then you had the option of re-enlisting, and most did not. So, roughly every 17 months or so, you're starting the war over with fresh troops. So it's hard to gain ground and permanent traction because the overall strategy of how we're going to fight the war is not very smart. There's this rumor that if John F. Kennedy wouldn't have been killed, he would have kept us out of Vietnam. Well, the numbers say otherwise, and there's other proof that says otherwise. Lyndon Johnson kept all of Kennedy's advisors, including Robert McNamara, who was the head of defense. And it was Robert McNamara in 1968 who told Lyndon Johnson, oh, by the way, we can't win this war, which is why Lyndon Johnson says, I'm not going to run for re-election. They were continuing the process of the war that started under Kennedy. And all of these things lead to the protests, more government decisions. By the way, we're just supposed to be fighting in South Vietnam below the 17th parallel. We're not supposed to be fighting in North Vietnam. By the way, we were the whole time. We're not supposed to be fighting in Laos or Cambodia. We were fighting there practically the whole time. And it's discovered under Nixon that we're doing this, but it's something that had been going on the whole time. And the main reason why was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We would bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was described on TV like it was a great big interstate. And in reality, it was these really small trails, some of which were underground. And as we would bomb this location, they would just move it further and move it further and move it further. So the idea is we had to try to do something to stop the influx of more troops and more supplies into the South, which leads to the controversy of, well, this is supposed to be a limited war, a quote-unquote police action, as the term was commonly used in the 70s and 80s. Well, it doesn't look like a limited war if you're expanding it outside of South Vietnam. And all of these political factors, it divides the Democratic Party, which was in rule, and in reality, it allows for Nixon to be elected president in 68 and in 72. And then the other aspect of this is, there's massive debate within the historical community of, did we win Vietnam or did we lose Vietnam? And what most military historians say is this: we won all the battles, but we lost the politics of the war. Where you can only fight in the South, you can only go after Viet Cong, Charlie. That was communist in the South. But as soon as that communist goes from the South to the North, he's now Vietnam, and you're not supposed to fight at him. But oh, by the way, he can shoot at you. So the political aspect of the war, the political turmoil, leads to more and more controversy, and is going to lead to the legacy of Vietnam being such a was the Hamlet Program, where we go into villages, we teach them to be good little non-communists, we give them food and supplies and all this other stuff, and then we leave. In theory, it was a good idea. And I almost saw a fight at a history conference one day because someone said that the Hamlet Program was successful and someone else said it was not. Just kind of throwing that out there. Here's the problem. Here's why it didn't work. We didn't have enough resources to be everywhere. And a lot of these people in Vietnam were starving. And they were going to be loyal to the person who gave them food last. It had nothing to do with political ideology. It had everything to do with survival. So the Hamlet Program overall fails. What is the main theme of the war? In the words of Lyndon B. Johnson, we're going to bomb the ever-loving hell out of them. We're going to try to destroy the jungle. We didn't like the idea of fighting guerrilla warfare. We wanted to bring them out on the open, a frontal assault. They weren't interested in that. They continued to move. They continued to use the jungle. They continued to hide. Guerrilla warfare. So the bombing's not working even though we do it throughout the whole war. Listen, during the Tet Offensive, we dropped enough bombs on the Khe Sanh area to be the equivalent of 5 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima. I mean, we're bombing the living daylights out of them. And they're still not, quote unquote, surrendering. So we got to have a better ground policy. We got to have a better ground strategy. And it's called the Phoenix Program. Search and destroy. So soldiers would go out, they would search an area. If anybody shot at them or if they thought they saw Charlie, they'd shoot back. And then they'd come back. And then they'd repeat it again in a few weeks. And then they'd come back. And they repeat it again in a few more weeks. In other words, they're going out in this territory and soldiers are being shot, they're being wounded, they're being killed, and what are they gaining? They're not gaining any territory. You know, typically in war, you determine who wins by we are going to invade you and we are going to take over. Well, we didn't have that type of strategy. So therefore, you lose 5,000 men in 2 months, and not a piece of territory has changed hands. What have you gained? The answer is nothing. But you've lost 5,000 men. And now you have 5,000 families who are angry at you. This is why they were like, why are we fighting? What's the strategy? What's the plan? It's not like World War II where you're trying to oust the Nazis. You're trying to oust the Japanese. And then we have Mali, which occurred in March of '68. There are lots of rumors that U.S. soldiers were involved in the killing of civilians over and over and over and over and over in Vietnam. Most of those incidences are not confirmed. But Mali 4, Mali was a village, is confirmed. We lined up men, women, and children, and we shot them. And when stories about Mali and other rumors get out, they're reported on the news, and it only adds to more and more opposition. Now, there is a really, really dark aspect of war that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But imagine you and 100 others are on patrol, and you come across a child who has their hands behind their back. You think nothing of it, you pass by, all of a sudden that child hurls a grenade, kills 50 of the men. The men who survived, next time they come across with a child, their hands behind their back. What's going to be in their memory? That child throwing a grenade. Is it very possible and probable that other innocent civilians were killed? Yeah. But we don't know for sure. You also have Agent Orange, which was the pesticide used to destroy the jungle. Soldiers were told it was okay to bathe in these barrels because they were orange barrels. They were told it was okay to collect drinking water because clean drinking water in Vietnam was a constant problem. We know what happens. Many of them get cancer, massive nerve damage. One of my former professors said, this is Dr. Thacker, said that if you really want to understand what happened to a lot of these young men, their nervous system was fried by acute intoxication from the pesticides. And they never, ever, ever recovered, which to me is one of the long-lasting impacts of the war. You know, you have the soldiers coming home. It's not popular. They're booed, they're spit on. Well, why? Well, they're hearing on the news about Milo, and they're associating that with every soldier. They don't understand why we're over there fighting. They're angry with the government. And this Agent Orange, to me, is the one legacy of the war that has never fully been dealt with. We've given millions of dollars, but frankly, that's not enough. You know, these individuals should have had complete medical care, mental care, and everything else for the rest of their lives, but unfortunately, our government doesn't always work that way. You also have the fear of other Vietnams in terms of legacy. When we went to Grenada, I think in 1983, this will not be another Vietnam. Persian Gulf War of 1990-91. President George Bush said countless times, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be. We're going to go in, we're going to kick their tails, and we're getting out. Which, by the way, led to problems down the road. This entire idea that you don't want to get bogged down in an area. And in a lot of ways, it could be argued that Afghanistan really became a second Vietnam. Because we gained territory and then we gave it away. I don't want to get into that because it gets kind of political quick. But the point is, you don't want anything like this to happen ever again. You know, we vote, pretty much the decision was towards the end of the Vietnam War, either we raise the draft to 21 or we lower the voting age to 18. Well, there was no way, and you know where, they were going to raise the draft age. They lowered the voting age to 18 in what's known as the Vietnam Amendment. It is another aspect of the legacy. And then you have distrust of the government. In the 1930s and 40s, families would gather around the radio to listen to FDR. And they heard FDR's voice so much, he was like a grandfather sitting in the room telling the family that everything was going to be okay. And then you go through the 50s, and Vietnam picks up in the 60s. And then you have the idea of Vietnamization, and the 70s, which leads to us leaving. And now all of a sudden you add that, and you add in Watergate, and the public no longer trusts the government. The government's the bad guy, especially the federal government. And if you want proof of this, all you need to do is look at approval ratings of Congress over the last 40 years. It's almost always negative. And then, of course, you have the rivalry between the media and the government. It is the war in Vietnam that primarily allows for the media to make its claim that it is the quote-unquote unofficial fourth branch of government. The media, the relationship between the two. And you see that overall, both sides, and I'm using the 2022 example, if you're watching Fox News or CNN or whatever, they both claim to be representing the people. And whether they are, it's up for debate. But it creates a much more adversarial relationship between the media and the government. This distrust from the public spills over there and is exploded. And needless to say, these legacies of Vietnam and the controversies that existed during the war only make the war more controversial. Still to this day, discussions at history conferences and things like that that are on the Vietnam War tend to get very loud. Never seen a fist fight, came close once, but the war left that kind of impact on American society. It changed the world. It changed the American public's view of government, the military, and should we be, quote unquote, big brother around the world? Now, real quick, go through this very fast. Sources, Dr. Thompson, I had him for a graduate class on Korea and Vietnam, the two wars. George Herring's America's Longest War. George Herring's a former professor at the University of Kentucky. Vietnam by Hugh Higgins. Vietnam, A History and Anthology by James Mooney. And then 15 months in SOG, a Warrior's Tour, by Tom Nicholson, Americans at War by Stephen Ambrose. And since Vietnam, the U.S. and World Affairs from 73 to 95 from H.W. Brands, and then countless primary documents of firsthand experience. So with all that being said, I've talked a lot. And I think I kept it to 30 minutes, which is pretty good for me. Does anybody have any questions? We'll take in the room first. Does anybody have any questions? Did I bore you? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
You talked about the increasing number of advisors. I wanted to talk more about the role and like what sort of action they were taking on the ground.
They called them advisors, and to start off with, they were quote unquote military trainers. In other words, individuals that went in and were supposed to train the South Vietnamese army. It was discovered very early into the process, and there's speculation as to when. You know, is it 1962 or is it 1958, somewhere in that ballpark, that all of a sudden we go from advising to fighting with. And that lays the groundwork for more and more ground forces. And it's under Kennedy that really, really expands. Like I said, I think in 62, it was roughly 9,000. And then at the end of 63, you know, he died in November. It's almost 17,000, almost double. And these are primarily troops that are going in, and they're still supposed to be more of an advisory role because we're not supposed to be officially fighting until after the Gulf of Tonkin, but we're fighting. It's one of those things that, you know, it's kind of like the fighting in Laos and Cambodia that took place the whole time. The government said it didn't. You know, look at that white pony over there. You know, look at the pony. Don't look over here. But it happened the whole time, which makes it very controversial in terms of when exactly do you put a point. And I think I have even a little bit more information to support this. Prior to 1965, there were 267 Americans that had died in Vietnam. That's evidence that we were fighting. We weren't just doing nothing. And then, of course, it greatly expands to where in 1968, we have over 14,000 that died. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Like we sacrifice more than the States, the France, the country, sacrifice at the end, lives lost, or
Of course, you know, they surrendered the 12,000 troops, and Charles de Gaulle's overall mindset was he wanted to quote unquote regain French greatness. Which I would argue he had to go back to Charlemagne today. And that was a really, really long time ago. But when they lost in Vietnam, it's almost like de Gaulle, who was president of France, just said, eliminate, wipe from memory. It's now their problem. And he was so focused on trying to rebuild France. There was a major fear in France in the 1950s about Americanization. There's a book called Seducing the French. It's not a love story, but it's about how the American way of life in some ways was seducing the young people in France. They started to wear Levi's. They started to drink American champagne, AKA Coca-Cola. And there was a great uproar in France that society, especially young people, were becoming too Americanized. And you can see that when, you know, Charles de Gaulle tells the U.S. government, share your nuclear secrets with us. And we said no. Namely because we were afraid that he would either A, sell it to the Soviets or the Soviets would get it. And he said, you know what, I'll just do what I want and I'll create my own nuclear weapons. So it's almost as if when they lose in Vietnam, it's just like wiped from memory, they go on. But we got to hang on to Algeria. We got to hang on to other French possessions. Jim was first, I'm sorry.
What year did the draft go to 18?
Oh, was that 63 or was it 64?
That's what I'm thinking. But, what did the draft lottery start?
And that was, if I'm not mistaken, in 64 is when the draft, or was it 65? I'm thinking it's one of the two, but probably 65. Because, you know, after the Gulf of Tonkin, that's when, you know, it was, you know, we need 100,000 more men and we can nip this in the bud. And then it was, we need another 100,000 men and another 100,000 men. Next thing you know, we got almost 550,000 men in 1969. So it has to be in that ballpark there. I didn't write that down.
I know it was then in 68, so I was not. That was huge. But the 18 was under Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
You're sure the lottery was.
Yeah, Johnson was president until January 69. Yes, Dean Hyman.
You've got some comments and questions online, so I'm just going to come a little closer to the microphone. So Carmen Gaskins has said this is great information that she learned quite a bit from you today. Dr. Embry has said this is very well done. She shared that her father was in the Navy for 7 tours and that your comments about the way that veterans were treated when they returned were right on point. Esther has commented, thank you for connecting the dots for us. She said that your talk is starting to help make sense of all the many social movements that were going on at the time. You have a question. I'm going to skip down to one more comment and then I'm going to go back up to the question. Heather Daffern has commented this is very informative. She says she loves history and that this took her back to her history classes at WKU, and she says, thank you, Professor Kennedy. Now, this question is coming from a student, Catherine B. She said, this was really great. She said, what was the immediate response from the government after the war? Did they issue an apology or do anything like that to the affected U.S. soldiers, or did they do anything to help them re-enter society?
Not, and the short answer is not really, not much. One, originally, and those of you who are alive then, if I'm not mistaken, originally the government rejected the claims of Agent Orange. And it's not until like 78, kind of when I was born, maybe 79, that, you know, that there had been some medical research done that kind of changed that. I mean, listen. seen the movie Rambo? I'm not talking about the crazy action part of Rambo. How did a lot of Vietnam soldiers, when they came back, they had virtually nothing to come back to. You know, they didn't have any jobs. There was no government protection. You know, you had this job before you entered the service. You got the job when you come back. There was none of that. So a lot of them kind of became roamers. They became nomads looking for work, looking for food or whatever. And if you're familiar again with that movie First Blood, Rambo goes into a town and he's looking for something to eat. And then, of course, there's the conflict between him and the sheriff, Brian, I forgot his, hey, thank you. Forgot his last name for a second. And that leads to the massive explosion in the movie. But for the most part, the government did very little. There was, another thing to mention, Nixon had a secret agreement, he and Kissinger, with South Vietnam, that if the North invaded, we would come back and bail them out. We would send troops back. When Congress got word of this under Gerald Ford, because Gerald Ford tried to send troops back into Vietnam in late 74, I think it was, Congress said, no, we're not sending any more troops. We're not sending any more money or anything else to Vietnam. So it's just another sign of the quote unquote secret agreements leading to the distrust.
Vietnam veterans were lepers.
Yes.
They were treated like lepers, they were unclean.
That's a good way to put it. I never thought of it that way, but I'll remember that.
So Professor Kendi, I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity just to thank you on behalf of our division for your presentation. For someone who's been here 20 years, you still have an incredible passion, which I think we all can see, and I just want to praise you for that. You do have another question in the chat from Heather. She wants to know what or who exposed the atrocities that took place at My Lake. How did we come to find out about that?
Well, there were the stories from soldiers themselves, and then of course there's also Jane Fonda, who got the nickname Hanoi Jane, who kind of laid the foundation for a lot of the stories that came out. If I am not mistaken, and I didn't write down names or anything, I probably should have where I could have consulted. But it was some of the troops that were a part of the My Lai massacre that actually reported it back to superiors, and superiors did nothing. And then when they got back on U.S. soil, they reported it to the media, and it kind of served as proof of what Jane Fonda and others had been saying. Now, if I'm not 100% accurate on that, I apologize, but I think I'm very, very close.
Catherine, thank you for answering her question about the return of the soldiers.
Anything? Oh, sorry, Sherry.
To ask you about class in the book, dear Anne, class and economic background is big. Part of the characters, graduate school, bill, and chooses to enlist. Says it's unfair that so many people in the draft,
Yes.
farming communities, or less means, and then a lot of people from the more affluent families were in graduate school or in college deferring their draft or have a connection. So I wanted you to maybe address class.
Pretty much every war is a rich man's war, poor man's fight. There's multiple reasons for that. Some are excusable, some are not. For example, and you see this World War II, etc. If someone is a teacher or a doctor, you're not going to send them to the front lines, right? They have a skill that you don't want to sacrifice. Individuals that were drafted and they were poor, they couldn't afford to stay in college forever. You know, kind of like the movie Animal House. Why were all those guys trying to stay in school forever even though they were flunking out? They were trying not to go to Vietnam. That was the entire idea, you know. All of a sudden, well, I'm not just gonna finish with a bachelor's, I'm gonna start on a master's. A lot of that does play very heavily on economics. And, you know, there wasn't all the funding back then that there is now in terms of people of lower incomes being able to go to school. So it is very much a rich man's war, a poor man's fight. And not only that, but as I was kind of alluding to, there are rumors about African Americans being more on the front line than other races. There have been studies that have been done, some of which have said, yes, that's true, and others have said, no, that's not 100% true. And part of the basis is there's really technically no front lines in Vietnam. It's not a frontal war. So I mentioned Khe Sanh earlier. Khe Sanh was a hotbed for fighting. You know, there are others right outside of Ley, which is spelled Q, Hue, and others where, you know, the fighting kind of became more intense. And depending on the sources used, some people have made the argument and some people have said the argument's not true. I'll be honest, I've not looked at it that 100% close, so I cannot say, but I would say again, just the overall basis of you're not sending an engineer, you're not going to send a lawyer, you're not going to send a teacher, you're not going to send a doctor to the front lines. Therefore, it really does become a poor man's fight. Probably the best example of that in all of American history is the Civil War, because individuals were able to buy their way out of fighting. In Vietnam, you could actually join the military service and like join the Air Force to become a fighter. If you become a fighter pilot, you're not going to Vietnam. They don't have an Air Force. We need bombers. And so therefore, there were ways that people who had resources could maybe manipulate the system a little bit. I'm trying to be very kind if you understand what I'm saying. I mean, you know, people with resources always manipulate. Never mind. Yes.
Most powerful person in the county was Cameron the draft.
Yes.
Also about teaching, and it's over a lot of us teaching. But my roommate and I both were English majors. I was hired to teach at my high school, my alma mater. He couldn't get a job at his alma mater. He went to he had to, not only had to be a teacher, but a teacher.
Yeah, there was also this thing, if I'm not mistaken, if I would have been alive during Vietnam, I would have been messed up. I'd have been one of the first to go because the way my birthday fell and how they did the draft set up. So I'm kind of glad I wasn't alive back then. Anything else? Well, those in attendance, thank you for attending. Those online, I thank you for attending. I hope I wasn't too boring, and I hope you learned something, and we laid some foundational information today. Thank you very much.
I can just say one more thing. I know everybody's very busy and has places to go, but just want to remind you, we do have other upcoming Kentucky Reads events we're very excited about. We have 3 more presentations scheduled. Dr. John Thomerson will be presenting Thursday on Vietnam and music, so we're very excited for that. We also have Dr. Calhoun French coming to moderate a discussion of the book and share some comments about nostalgia and what could have been. She is our Kentucky Humanities Scholar, and the Learning Commons has secured her for a presentation. We're very excited about that. And of course, our own Jim Turner will be doing a presentation about public speaking and the media, and just basically the influence of the passion and how those speakers influence their audiences during the time. So we're excited about all those events. If you'd like to join those, there's information in the SKYCTC student newsletter that comes out in email, and also the bite-sized news for employees.